Hi everyone, it's me, Dr. Kate. We're in our final unit of our winter session course, and we're almost there. I know you've all been working really hard with the reading and discussion boards, and just a few more left to go. So I want to say a few words to introduce this third unit about politics and the state. And in this unit, you'll begin with a very dense reading by Gail Rubin. And as I note on the syllabus, there's some disturbing she has some disturbing discussions of childhood sexual abuse in this essay. So if you need to bring special coping tools with you for this reading, please do so. But the reason I'm having you read it is because it is the first major article in our field, excuse me, Kat, that defines sexuality as an area of study distinct from gender studies, and that we have to think about sexuality critically when we're thinking about politics. So we're going to start with that essay, and then I'll say a few words about the first case study. I'll do two case studies in this unit. One is about, my cat is acting up over there. One of the case studies is about same-sex marriage, and the second case study is about incarceration and how that affects sexually or sex non-normative communities in particular. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with Rubin. So she opens her essay by arguing that sexuality has a politics all its own. And she notes that often things that look like political arguments that look like they're about sex are about much more than sex or about something else. So sex is often an alibi for talking about other political issues. And the most important section of this essay that I want you to focus on is her discussion of the ideological, what she calls ideological formations around sex. And she lists 5 of them. The first one is sex essentialism. The second is sex negativity. The third is the fallacy of the misplaced scale. The fourth is a hierarchical valuation of sex acts, what she gives us that picture of the charmed circle. And the fifth is what she calls the domino theory of sexual peril. So I'm going to talk through each of these 5 really quickly. So the first, sex essentialism. You've heard the word essentialism before in our opening discussion of how to do the history of sexuality. And she's arguing that scholars tend to imagine, and people tend to imagine, that sex is a timeless thing, that it's always been the same, and that it's sort of a permanent part of human existence. Now, as we learned in Unit 1, this is not necessarily true. The reason that it's important for her to talk about sex essentialism versus constructionism is to understand that sex is something that is argued about, negotiated, changes over time, is open to politics. If we didn't think so, if we didn't understand sex that way, then we wouldn't really have much to say about it. So this, I think, is best understood if we think about like gender essentialism. If you are a STEM major, for example, stats, computer science, you might notice that a lot of your classes have a lot more men in them than women. An essentialist understanding of why that is might be that men's brains work better with math or figures or space, right? They're better able to put things together than women who are good at words and feelings, and that's why we're all social work majors. So an essentialist approach to understanding gender wouldn't really have anything to say about why that happens. A constructionist approach says, okay, something's happening here that is, we have to understand what are the social sort of happenings that and political happenings that produce a world where we have women in social work at much higher rates than computer science, for example. And why are women paid so much less, social work professions paid so much less than others, than say computer science professions. And a constructionist approach would allow us to say, okay, well, what can we change so that the world is more just? In terms of sexuality, a sex essentialist approach might argue that, well, homosexuality is just wrong. It always has been, it always will be, and we need to get rid of homosexuality. A constructionist approach would say, hey, we're at a different, these are benign differences. What historically might produce them? How do we build a world that's just for all of us as these things change? So sex essentialism is this first ideological formation that Rubin's going to argue against. The second is sex negativity. And this is culture's, what she argues is like culture and politics tends to say no to sex. That's the answer. Sex is deemed it's deemed in a very negative way unless it's within, say, a heterosexual procreative relationship. If you think back to your sex ed classes, I think this ideological formation makes sense. Most of us in sex ed learned that sex was going to kill us because we were going to get diseases or we were going to get pregnant and that would ruin our lives, right? So think about your sex ed class. Very few of us took sex ed education courses that taught us about how sex can be pleasurable or how it's a regular part of a lot of people's human lives, and that's a good thing. Culture tends to be really negative about sex, even as we talk about it all the time, and it's used to sell us stuff, and it's in every song and every movie. It's still generally seen as negative if it's outside of these sort of very strict boundaries about what is good sex. A corollary to this is her third ideological formation around sex, called the fallacy of the misplaced scale. And in this section, Rubin is arguing that we tend to see, that culture and politics tends to see sexual crimes or sexual activity as much, much worse than anything else. So the idea that that like just having a different kind of taste around sexuality, right? So for example, being gay is like, could keep you, like, we don't want you to have a job, we don't want you to be around children. Think back to the myths we read about in the last book. This idea of who you are sexually attracted to, having these sort of like outsized sort of policing kinds of reactions, where you can get thrown into prison because you're 18 and you have sex with somebody who's 15 or something like that. So that's where it starts to get a little bit slippery. And I think that her discussion of age differences in sex can be really challenging to read through, because she's going to argue that that punishing people who have sex with people who are much younger than them and who are children is a bad thing. That's a sign of this fallacy of the misplaced scale. For a lot of us, that's hard to think about because of the sort of the damaging effects of childhood sexual abuse. Her larger point, I think, though, is what's important to take through, and this idea that why is a difference in sexual taste seen as so important, whereas, say, if you don't like tomatoes and I do, I don't think that, there's something morally wrong with you and you should go to prison. I just think, okay, so you don't like tomatoes, like more for me. But if, for example, I like to have sex with multiple partners and the rest of society, much of society thinks that's wrong, I risk my job, right? Or I can't be around children or something like that. So that's sort of her argument about this fallacy of the misplaced scale. I think best thought through this idea of differences in taste. All right, number 4, the hierarchical valuation of sex acts. The printing on her diagram of the charmed circle is a little hard to read, but what she's arguing there is that society and politics tends to value some sex acts over others. And the things that society values are inside that charmed circle, and on the outside are the outer limits. So the charmed circle are things like sex between two married people of opposite genders, sex for procreative purposes, sex that she calls it vanilla, so sex that doesn't involve toys or anything like that. Sex that's for free, right? If money changes hands, that's in the outer limits. So this is sort of her way of trying to explain how society and politics favors and some sex acts over others. And you can see this, for example, written in our tax codes, for example, where you get tax deductions for things like homeownership and having children, but there's nothing in there about like, well, maybe I have multiple dependents because I have multiple partners, right? So that's sort of on the outer limits, and the charm circle is what's inside. Now things can move in and out. So this essay was written in the 1980s, and I think that sex within a committed relationship that's not yet marital has moved into the charmed circle. I think some kinds of homosexual sex have moved into the charmed circle if it's married or in a committed relationship. So things move in and out. But this leads to her fifth ideological formation, this idea of the domino theory of sexual peril, where there's a sort of a political concern that as things move from the outer limits into the charmed circle, that there's this concern that there could be a collapse of sort of sexual morality altogether. So this domino theory is this idea that if something moves across that moves across that line towards being socially accepted, that we risk, then you can do, we won't have any morality at all. So I think the best example of this is in debates around same-sex marriage, when people would say, oh, if we let men marry men, then pretty soon people will want to marry their dogs. There's no evidence that there's no slippery slope there. That's not going to happen, but it's a good example of what Rubin's talking about, this social and political fear of a domino effect, that soon we're all going to be marrying our cats, as if that's a terrible thing. So these are the sort of the things that she's trying to argue against, just try and break through to make arguments about how to politically challenge some of these ideas, and also to challenge the kind of very negative disciplinary and carceral effects of these ideological formations on anybody who engages in sexual practices outside of the norm. So that's my very brief lecture about Rubin's essay that I hope helps situate some of her arguments. Now, the first case study for this unit is about same-sex marriage. And same-sex marriage is now legal across the United States. The Supreme Court made that true only a few years ago. I still think it's an important topic to think through because it tells us so much about how the state and political actors think about sexuality through this lens of marriage. So I've asked you to read a piece by Priya Kandaswamy, and this is going to offer sort of a critique of the fight for same-sex marriage from a perspective that might be unfamiliar to you, rather than the sort of two poles of same-sex marriage is important for for basic social justice and equality, versus same-sex marriage is going to destroy the nuclear family and lead us down a path to moral ruin. Kandaswamy makes a different argument, and she says, okay, well, what do advocates for same-sex marriage think they're going to get from same-sex marriage being legal? And will these things happen? And how, if we think about the way the state has attempted throughout much of its history to control poor people, particularly poor women and poor women of color, through rules about marriage in order to get social benefits. If we think about sort of marriage policy through that lens, how might it challenge some sort of common sense ideas that advocates of same-sex marriage have had? Really important to understand also from her essay is that marriage is a bunch of different things. We might use one word for it, but it's a civil institution where the state says, okay, here's this bundle of rights, rights to inheritance, to adoption rights, immigration rights. Here's this basket of rights, and marriage is a civil institution that lets you share that basket with one other person. Okay, so that's civil marriage. Religious marriage is different, right? Religious marriage happens in a church, has its own standards, doesn't necessarily have anything to do with whether or not the state gives you legal benefits from it. And then there's social marriage, and those are the sort of the things that you get if you're married. Some examples: being able to share a bedroom with your partner when you are home for the holidays. Being seen as an adult, right? You finally grew up and settled down, set down roots because you got married. I got married once and I made a Facebook video of it, and wow, I've never gotten so many likes. People really love marriage. So these are different kinds of marriage, and Kandaswamy will talk about the different benefits in each of these categories, so do pay attention to that. And I think the film that I've asked you to watch, called The New Black, which is specifically about the fight for same-sex marriage rights in the state of Maryland, pushes back on some of Kandaswamy's arguments. So I think can offer you sort of another perspective for thinking about same-sex marriage. So I look forward to your thoughts on this issue on the discussion board, and excuse me. And I will see you for our last lecture after that discussion board. Bye.